Um, well, Tish Harrison Warren or Tish Warren, which one?
Tish Harrison Warren, probably.
Yeah,
I
great.
mean, so I go like in real life, you can call me Tish Warren. Everyone at my church would call me Tish Warren, but since my book, all
Yep,
my public life is Tish Harrison Warren. So
great.
let's do that.
That's helpful. Well, Tish Harrison Warren, I'm really grateful that you're able to give me some time, give our church community some time. I've really loved your book, The Liturgy of the Ordinary. A lot of our people in our community have loved that. Your writing has been really helpful to us, and so you seem to have a kind of sensitivity to a life with God that I think we find helpful, and so I'm really grateful. Our church, we've been in this, you're in it too, but we've been in this season of pandemic and where our lives are hidden and we're less performative, and we're trying to make sense of that in our own lives. But I'd love to hear maybe your story. Where did you go from knowing about God to what would seem more like intimacy with Jesus?
Wow, that's a good question. For me, I don't think that can be. In other words, I sort of feel like, wow, well, maybe this morning was when I went from knowing about God to intimacy with Jesus. In other words, I think I don't know if there's a point for me as much as it's been this process. And so there's been certainly more than one time where I thought, oh man, maybe I wasn't even a Christian before, because I have this new sense of who God is. So in that sense, I talk. It's not. I've sort of become a Christian again and again and again. In the sense that I feel like it's hard for me to point to one moment where I sort of knew about God and then came to know God. I feel like even now I'm walking in this process of more and more intimacy with Jesus. So that might be an unsatisfactory answer. I can tell you there were some big moments of my life, I feel like, where I'll just name two. Honestly, I could talk. I mean, I could go through each year of my life and talk about times of this.
Yeah.
But I grew up sort of things that sort of were transformative to me, where I grew up Southern Baptist and always kind of heard about Jesus. But I didn't know much about grace. That I understood the gospel as kind of Jesus saves us, gets us kind of washes away our sin, and then we kind of climb the ladder of holiness through our own devotion, basically. And it wasn't until I got to college and asked a lot of questions about my faith, but also failed a lot. I mean, just failed a lot in the faith, that I learned about grace. So I was a Christian for a while before I really understood what it meant to sort of rest in our righteousness in Jesus. And so grace, the idea of God loving me, delighting in me, seeing the righteousness of Jesus in me, completely changed my view of God. Instead of, it was like Christianity was honestly something I thought I was fairly good at. Like I was, the church kid, the youth group kid. I wasn't good at basketball, but I was like good at being a Christian. That was like my thing. And so it felt like something that you could be good at, right? Like people are good at basketball or painting. And it wasn't until I realized kind of how wrecked I was and how wrecked we all are, that Christianity isn't something you can perform at, like basketball or painting or your job. It's something that it's a relationship with God that we rest in, that we fall on. And so when I learned about the idea of grace, it was like the world went from black and white to technicolor. It
Mm.
totally changed who I am. And I'm still not over it. I mean, honestly, I think my ministry to this day comes from wanting people to know their belovedness in Christ and to know about the gift of grace that I experienced. So that was one. I mean, I would also say I am into my next book. I promise this is not just a promotion for my next book, but but I wrote my next book somewhat out of, in 2017. I had kind of a crisis of faith. Not it was in many ways it wasn't a new crisis of faith. It was kind of old unanswered questions that I hadn't dealt with, that I had sort of ignored, around how can God allow suffering? How can God allow pain? And I think I struggle deeply with, if I can't trust God to keep bad things from happening to me and to the world, which apparently we can't, because God does allow bad things to happen to the world and to me, then how do I trust God at all? And so I know that it's almost a cliche kind of struggle, but it brought me to a place where it was just very difficult to pray, very difficult to trust God, to believe God cared about me or saw me. And and so walking through that and continuing in the faith, the fact that I am still now, like, I believe in Jesus. I believe in the gospel deeply. I believe God loves me and sees me. I feel like I have come to a greater depth of trusting God and knowing God than I had before then. So it took me, I mean, my next book is about this, and I joke that it took me writing 70,000 words to decide if I trust God. But it did. It took me writing 70,000 words to decide if I can trust God. But I think on the other side of that, I am just grateful. I'm grateful that I feel like the Lord loves me enough that he would let me wrestle with 70,000 words over 2 years to be able to just say, I love you and I trust you. It took me 70,000 words to be able to say those 6 words, I love you and I trust you, to God.
So, I mean, I think it's interesting. We've done a few of these interviews with folks like this, and a really normal theme is intimacy with Christ, and a kind of depth of trust that you're talking about didn't come through some new insight from some book, or even from some sermon. I'm sure that happens for a lot of people, but just the normal witness that we're getting a lot, I think, from these interviews, it's either, and you've said, both failure, being able to morally keep up, and suffering,
Yeah.
and wrestling with suffering. And you know, you don't want to hope for a pandemic, because I don't want this to ever happen again. But there is a strange hope in sensing that, you know, these moments of shift and suffering and loss and maybe even weariness has an opportunity to be deeply transformative.
Yeah, I think it's the only way. I wish there was an easier way. And I think I don't think that discounts sermons or books. I actually think it was years of sermons and books that allowed me to encounter God in the suffering.
Yeah.
And my church community. Oh Lord, without my church community, I would have been lost. Like, I think so 2017, what somewhat brought this on, as we moved across the country, I lost my father. My father passed away a week after. So I'm from Texas. We left Texas. A week later, my dad died back in Texas. And then we had, my husband and I had a miscarriage 3 weeks later, and then we unexpectedly got pregnant again. I had a very complicated pregnancy where I had to be on bed rest, which was really hard. And then I would not recommend bed rest. It sounds fun, but it's not in reality. And then we lost our son, our second son, in the second trimester. So it was about 6 months of difficult stuff. Not honestly, not an out of the ordinary. It's like ordinary suffering that many people have experienced, losing a parent, or miscarrying, but was painful. And so I feel like I met God, or God met me in that suffering. But it was through my church community. I mean, it was when you're talking about books or sermons, like the faith of other people carried me in ways that I couldn't show up for. I mean, I did physically show up, but I'm saying I couldn't get myself, if there's any evangelical impulse that we have to like get ourselves to some specific kind of emotional experience of God or even cognitive experience of God, I wasn't up for any of that. And so I had to be sort of held in the faith by my community and by the practices of the faith that I have inherited, primarily prayer and worship and the sacraments. So that sort of is what allowed God to carry me through that. But I do feel like that experience, which really was kind of over a year and a half of suffering, brought me nearer to God. But I do think it's there are places, this is what I'll say, this is the analogy I use in the book. I didn't mean to talk about my next book so much, I promise in this, but there's this certain kind of flower, it's a, there's a whole class of flowers that only bloom at night. And they just will not bloom in the light. They only bloom in the dark. And I think in the same way, there's certain things in our spiritual life that only grow amidst darkness. They only grow in times of suffering. And I wish there was some easier way, but I don't think there is.
Yeah. Yeah. Henri Nouwen, he says, in order to get humility, it takes an awful lot of humiliation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably for intimacy, it probably takes a good bit of suffering.
Yeah, yeah, and it all goes together. I think that suffering humbles, it humiliates us. But that word, humiliate, is from humanus, which is the same word we get human from, and so I think it humanizes us as well, in the sense of it makes us more fully able to be beautifully limited human beings, to be to learn of our creatureliness in a way that connects us to the creator. I mean, humiliation humanizes, is what I'm trying to say. So if we want to be fully human, flourishing as human beings, the only path is one of humiliation. I mean, we see that in Jesus, right? I mean, the ultimate picture of flourishing is Jesus. And then when you look at Jesus, you see a man acquainted with grief.
Yeah, I was trying to, in my mind before you went there, I was trying to swing this. All right, we just said suffering and humiliation is the key to intimacy. How do we make this good news? And I think that's good news is, it really is a participation with Jesus.
It's a participation with Jesus. Absolutely. It's a participation in the sufferings of Jesus. And then we find the resurrection in that. I mean, when I say humiliation humanizes, I mean, we're not made to be non-human. In other words, we're not made to be invulnerable. We're not made to be perfect. We're not made to be, well, we were made to be perfect. I'm not talking about morally here, but I'm saying unlimited. We were not made to be like masters of our own destiny.
Yeah.
that and so being able to be free to be limited, needy human beings. We were needy in the garden. We needed
Yes.
other people and we needed God. So there's a gift in that. And through that, so um, there's this phrase that was used in the medieval church a lot that I talk about in my book. It sounds funny. I mean, but it's per crucum ad lucum. Have you heard this? That it's through the cross to the light, per crucum ad lucum.
Mhm.
And um, and the idea is that through the cross to the light is that it is through, we have to journey through the cross to find light, to find resurrection, to be able to see light, like vision of soul, to be able to see the world in the way that it truly is, in the way that is leads most to our own flourishing even.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the good news is that everyone will suffer. I mean, it's not like Christians are the only ones that suffer, but that we come to know God through our suffering. The good news is knowing God.
It is interesting. We're going through the Gospel of John right now. And in the wedding at Cana and the meeting with Samaritan woman at the well, those are the first people who kind of hear this is who Jesus is most meaningfully. Or those are the moments. And the only people in the wedding at Cana who see the miracle are servants.
Mm,
Um, they're the people who, we talked about it. They're the people low enough to see. And I think that's part of the sign is that no one recognized it. Everyone great at the party missed it, but the servants saw it. And the Samaritan woman is, she's an outsider. And she's been humiliated in a lot of ways. And so, I think we're trying to, in our community, we're experiencing a lot of humiliation, and a lot of hiddenness, and we can't shine in the ways.
yeah,
A lot of our
I
community are performers, and we just can't shine the way and that's a kind of suffering. There are people who love to sing, and they're just not able to sing,
mm,
and so there's got to be some sort of impact that God is having on that season.
yeah. Just this morning, I was reading in Luke where the disciples were talking among themselves, deciding who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus says to them, um, essentially, you will be like me because I am one who serves.
Mm.
And he says something like, who is greater, the one reclining at table or the servant serving him? And he says, the one reclining at table, but you follow one who is a servant, who serves. And I was like, oh, I just really, I mean, we can be sentimental, I think, about that, and like, oh, servant, we want to serve. But the reality is serving is hard, and
Yeah.
we don't, and I would much rather be reclining at table eating a good meal than being the servant. And so um, I don't want to. I think it's easy as Christians because we throw around service language so much to make that sentimental, and not realize what a radical thing that is to say that God became a servant, and therefore we are called not to be the greatest, but to follow him in being the servant. And um, the kind of mortification, like with the death that means for us over and over, is not insignificant. And I don't want your people to therefore hear, so buck up and be a servant. I think that there is the calling of Jesus is difficult, and so it is one where we where we can mourn how that is difficult. We can tell God how it is difficult to be a servant. Jesus knows because he is a servant. And so I think there's life in that, but I don't think it's a cakewalk. I really don't. And
Yeah.
so I think we need to be able to be honest with God about how it's difficult to be faithful to him, how trying to be faithful to him is painful.
So if you've just told a bunch of New Yorkers that they need to be humiliated,
Yeah,
uh,
sorry.
what are some, what
Say,
are,
blame it on Jesus.
how, for those of us who especially maybe um, intimacy with Christ seems, we long for that. I imagine there's lots of people in my church right now who really long for that and find just getting started overwhelming. They think maybe when we talk about intimacy with Jesus, they immediately begin to think about a few of the leaders in the church rather than themselves first. And so how would you, just in like a spiritual director sort of way, um, pastor them and encourage them to get started? Um,
Yeah,
does that make sense?
yeah. Um, it's hard because I feel like that's such an individual question in ways. Like different people, like there are some certain people I would counsel towards silence, and there's certain people I would counsel towards journaling, and there's certain people I would counsel towards going out and hiking, and there's some people I'd counsel towards staying in and being alone, practicing solitude. So I don't know. There's not a way. In general, I would say um, that the things we do again and again and again are what form us.
Mhm.
So we aren't looking for a particular spiritual outcome that you can check off, so we're not looking for a particular like emotional state or and I want to say this especially because we're talking about performance. It was funny, I spoke at it was something with Redeemer New York for small group leaders, and I remember, I can't remember what I was talking about, but it was something about resting in God. And I think it might have even been about Sabbath keeping and rest. And the question that I got was basically like, how can how can you how can I make this something that I can check off my to-do list? Like, how can I make rest something I can be the very, very best rester at? Like, I want to get an A+ at not performing and resting. And it was so funny because it was like, yeah, this is gonna have to just like switch your paradigm, right? This is a challenge. And I am absolutely one of these people that wants to sort of know what I'm supposed to do so I can do it and control it. And that's not what intimacy with Jesus is. I mean, it's just it's not. So all that to say, some of this is just repetition. It's just coming back to the same practices again and again, and they form us over time. And on any given Wednesday, it may be frustrating or feel like a waste of time or feel empty, or you may encounter scriptures that you don't actually like or aren't sure what to think about. And but the point isn't any one moment in that. The point is coming to grow in the love of God.
Yeah.
So and beyond that, I would say, I mean, I feel like I go around the country and I talk about the need for church, the need for the community, and being formed through our worship and sacraments together, or communion and baptism. Um, and I talk about practicing prayer and different sorts of prayer. I mean, I would encourage people to experiment with different kinds of prayer, but
Yeah.
prayer and then and silence and solitude and reading the scriptures. And then I always feel like, why are you guys paying me to talk about this? Like, your Sunday school teacher can tell you to read the Bible, go to church, and pray. But to some extent, there's not, I want people to know there's not like a bonus round of the Christian life that we're hiding from you. There's not some kind of secret ceremony that special Christians know. Like, the things that we have been given are the scriptures, to meditate on them, to make them like part of our very body and bones and
Yeah.
inside of us. We've been given the church by Jesus, and we've been given prayer, and those things have carried the church for 2,000 years, through plagues, through riots, through injustice, through oppression, through transformation of the world. And so, I mean, there's a lot more I could say, but I will say that I think starting with reading the scriptures, particularly the Gospels and the Psalms, and practicing prayer and being in community and then doing it again and again and again over a lifetime is the way that we have learned to walk in the way of Jesus.
Yeah, just to highlight the mundane again, my wife and I, we've been married for 17 years now, and what we always tell couples that we're counseling is that intimacy doesn't come by resisting mundane moments together. Like, it's through the mundane moments. It's through the sitting on the couch with a glass of wine after 50,000 meetings and dentist appointments and all of these things, just kind of blinking your way until it's time to go to bed together. But it's maintaining those times. It's not resisting them. It's not escaping them. It's maintaining those mundane moments.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just means, hey, maybe this week, two of those 3 days that you spent time with the Lord, you sort of blinked your way through, reading the scriptures. And, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, sorry, my alarm's going off. Someone said, if my kid woke up in the morning to sit on my lap and then fell back asleep, I wouldn't be mad at him. So when we wake up in the morning and fall asleep, it's not as if the Lord's like frustrated with us.
Yeah.
I think that's an encouragement.
Yeah, absolutely. Similarly, I mean, when you asked about my own experience of knowing Jesus more intimately, there are moments. I mean, I could point to specific moments of growth.
Oh, sure.
But much more so, it's been a process, and even those moments. I mean, if you asked me, when did you really come to know your husband, or when did you went from just knowing about your husband to knowing your husband? And I could tell you the first time I met him, but I barely knew him. And honestly, he's a completely different person now, 20 years later after I met him. And so there aren't sort of just high point moments where I've come to know him. It's day in and day out over time. And of course, there are some moments I can point to where things changed in our marriage, where we had a paradigm shift of the way we understood each other, where I came to know him in new ways or he became kind of different to me. But even those would not have happened if we hadn't just had sort of like the day in and day out for years leading up to that, right? And so I do think, like, any meaningful relationship is over time, and it's a process. And I think faith, it's easy for us to think about faith as a feeling or as even a mental assent to something. But I think it's useful to think of faith as a relationship, but also as a craft. I mean, it's something like anyone who is an artist will know you don't become an artist one day. You become an artist over your life. And
Helpful.
There's a musician that my um, daughter was talking about. My daughter's 9 years old, about to be 10, and she was learning the violin. And there was a guy she heard interviewed who was 99 and still practicing the violin, um, probably 5 or 6 days a week. And they said, "Why do you practice at this point? Because you're not performing." And he said, "Because I still feel like I have things to learn." And I feel like how much more, if that's true of the violin, how much more of is that true of the creator of the universe who knows us and loves us?
Well, you've been really generous with us. Thanks for giving us some of your time.
Yeah.
We really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks
So,
for talking.
well, take care, and I hope this summer is a good rest for you.
Thanks.